Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So, before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The air in the forest was unsettlingly still, as if the entire world held its breath. For friends, Mia, Jake, Claire, and Ryan pitched their tents in a clearing just beyond the forest's edge. They were thrill seekers, the kind who thrived on urban legends. The whispering trees of Whisperwood Forest had been a local tale for decades, and tonight they wanted to see if the stories were true. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and red. As darkness crept in, the group huddled around a crackling campfire, their laughter masking an unspoken tension. People say the trees talk when the wind dies down, Mia said, her voice low. They call your name, trying to lure you deeper into the forest. Ryan snorted. That's just small-town superstition. Trees don't whisper, Mia. They creak, maybe, but whisper. Come on. Jake tossed another log into the fire. We'll find out soon enough. The forecast said no wind tonight. As if on cue, the night grew unnervingly quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets. Just silence so heavy it pressed against their ears. The fire crackled louder, its pops and hisses filling the void. Then it started, a soft, barely audible whisper. At first, it sounded like the forest itself was exhaling. Then the words began to form. Mia, her head snapped up, eyes wide. Did you hear that? Hear what? Ryan asked, smirking. The whisper came again, more distinct. Mia. Claire froze, clutching Mia's arm. I heard it. It said your name. Jake leaned forward, scanning the dark line of trees. This is just someone messing with us. Locals trying to freak us out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Jake, Claire, Ryan. All four froze, their breaths hitching. The voices sounded impossibly close, yet no one was there. The firelight illuminated the surrounding trees, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal arms. I'm going to see what's out there, Ryan said, grabbing a flashlight. Don't, Mia pleaded, grabbing his wrist. But Ryan shook her off, his bravado masking the fear in his eyes. It's just a stupid trick. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness as he stepped into the forest. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, as if the trees were arguing amongst themselves. And then they stopped. The silence was worse. Ryan? Claire called out, her voice trembling. No response. Minutes ticked by, stretching into an eternity. Jake grabbed another flashlight and stood. Stay here, he said, his voice firm but shaking. I'll find him. Mia and Claire huddled closer to the fire, their eyes darting between the trees. Jake disappeared into the shadows, his flashlight a dim speck swallowed by the darkness. The whispers returned, but this time they weren't calling names. The voices were chanting something low and guttural, a sound that made Mia's stomach churn. Mia, Claire whispered, her voice shaking. The trees. Mia followed Claire's gaze. The trunks of the trees surrounding their camp were etched with fresh carvings, deep, jagged words that hadn't been there before. Run before it finds you. Mia stumbled back, her heart hammering. What the hell is this? A scream tore through the forest. A scream so raw and primal, it made their blood run cold. It was Jake. Without thinking, Mia and Claire bolted into the forest, the firelight fading behind them. The whispers grew deafening, circling them, disorienting them. They found Jake's flashlight first, its beam flickering weakly on the ground. Next to it was Ryan's shoe, torn and stained with blood. And then they saw it. A tree, impossibly large and ancient, stood in the center of the clearing. Its bark was blackened, its branches twisted like claws. Hanging from its gnarled limbs were shreds of clothing, Ryan's jacket, Jake's scarf, and something that looked horrifyingly like hair. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, a cacophony of voices pleading and screaming. The tree seemed to pulse, its bark writhing as if something beneath it was alive. Mia grabbed Claire's hand. Run! They sprinted through the forest, branches tearing at their skin. The whispers chased them, growing louder with every step. When they finally burst into the clearing, the fire was out, and their tents were slashed to ribbons. They didn't stop. They ran until they reached their car, panting and shaking. As they sped away, Mia glanced in the rearview mirror. The forest loomed behind them, dark and silent. But for a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, a figure with eyes that glowed like embers. They never spoke of that night again, but every so often, Mia swore she could hear faint whispers in the wind calling her name. Story 2. It was supposed to be a perfect camping trip for friends Jake, Emma, Lila, and Chris. Had ventured into Blackwood Forest, a place known for its serene beauty and miles of untouched wilderness. They pitched their tents near a small clearing, a perfect spot surrounded by towering pines. By nightfall, the campfire crackled warmly, casting golden light and flickering shadows onto their laughing faces. Ghost stories were Jake's idea. He was always the storyteller, with a knack for bringing everyone to the edge of their seats. "All right," Jake said, leaning forward, his grin splitting his face. "This one's called the Shadow Watcher." "Oh, great," Emma groaned. "Another shadow story? You've done this 100 times." "Not this one," Jake said. He lowered his voice and began, spinning a tale about a dark figure that stalked campers who didn't respect the woods. The others listened, nervously laughing when the story reached its climax. But it wasn't the story that unsettled Lila. It was the flickering on the edge of the firelight. At first, she thought it was the way the fire danced, making the shadows jump and warp. But this one was different. It moved too deliberately, a dark blot swaying back and forth like someone pacing just out of reach. "Hey," Lila interrupted, pointing. "Do you see that?" "What?" Chris asked, turning his head. "Over there." She squinted. "By the trees. It's moving." The group turned toward the edge of the clearing. The flickering shadow was there, indistinct but unmistakably humanoid, its movements sharp and jittery. Jake laughed nervously. "It's just a fire, Lila. You're letting the story get to you." "No, it's not," she insisted, her voice trembling. "Look at it. It's not matching anything. There's no one standing there." Emma frowned and stood, shining her flashlight toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't touch the shadow. It stayed in place, defying the light. "That's weird," Emma admitted, stepping closer to the fire. "All right, this isn't funny," Chris said, his voice a mix of anger and fear. "Who's out there?" Silence answered him. The forest had gone unnervingly quiet. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves. The shadow took a step closer, still on the edge of the firelight. It was as if it knew the light was a boundary it couldn't cross. "We're leaving," Jake said, standing abruptly. "This is whatever this is, it's not worth sticking around for." They hurried to extinguish the fire, stomping on the embers and kicking dirt over the glowing coals. The moment the light dimmed, the shadow moved, slithering closer. "It's coming," Lila screamed. Panic gripped them as they grabbed their gear and bolted into the woods, their flashlights swinging wildly. But no matter how fast they ran, the shadow stayed close, always just beyond the light's edge, its shape shifting unnaturally, like it wasn't bound by the rules of the physical world. "It's following us," Emma yelled, nearly tripping over a root. Chris stopped abruptly, panting. "Wait, what if it's the fire? Maybe it only shows up near the fire. Then why is it still here?" Jake shot back, his flashlight beam trembling in his hands. Lila whimpered, pointing behind them. "Because it's not the fire. It's us." The shadow loomed closer, the air growing colder with each step it took. Their flashlights began to flicker, the batteries draining as if the darkness itself was feeding on them. "What do we do?" Emma cried, tears streaming down her face. "We keep moving," Jake shouted, but the forest felt endless, the towering trees stretching into infinity. The shadow closed in, and the world around them seemed to fold into darkness. One by one, their flashlights died, leaving only the pale moonlight to guide them. And then, even that was gone. The next morning, Blackwood Forest Rangers found the campsite abandoned, the fire cold but oddly untouched. 4 sets of footprints led into the woods, but none led back out. As for the shadow, it still lingers in Blackwood Forest, waiting for the next campfire, the next story, the next group of friends to wander too close to the edge of the light. Story 3. Anna was lost, though she hated admitting it. She had ventured too far off the trail, her map a crumpled mess of rain-soaked pulp, and the GPS on her phone had died hours ago. It was just her and the towering, whispering trees now. Every path looked the same, every shadow stretched too long, and every sound in the forest made her heart quicken. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the woods in shades of orange and gray, Anna's stomach twisted with unease. She needed to find shelter soon. Then, through the thick underbrush, she spotted it, a backpack slumped against a tree like a forgotten relic. It was old and tattered, the canvas worn thin, and its seams frayed. A dark stain spread across one side, like ink or something worse. But Anna's desperation outweighed her apprehension. Maybe it belonged to a hiker who had been here recently. Maybe it had supplies. She crouched beside it, wrinkling her nose at the sour, metallic smell emanating from the bag. With trembling fingers, she unzipped it. Inside, She found a flashlight, dim but functional, and a crumpled water bottle. Then her hand brushed against something softer, a book. It was a journal, its leather cover cracked and mottled with mildew. Curious, Anna opened it, flipping through pages filled with rushed, panicked handwriting. To anyone who finds this, leave the woods. Leave now. I'm sorry for what I've done. It attaches itself to you when you're alone. You'll hear it first, then feel it. There's no escape. The last entry was smeared, as though written in a hurry. It read, I buried it, but it always comes back. Anna closed the journal, her chest tightening. Buried what? She glanced at the backpack again, her unease deepening. She wanted to leave it behind, but the forest was growing darker, and the flashlight was the only thing she had to guide her. With no other choice, she slung the pack over her shoulder and trudged deeper into the woods, hoping to find a clearing or a sign of the trail. That night, Anna set up a makeshift camp. Her small tent was flimsy, offering little protection from the biting wind. She ate the last of her granola bars, trying to ignore the creeping dread that had been building since she found the bag. The woods were unnervingly quiet, as though every creature had fled. Then came the breathing. It started faint, like the sound of wind threading through leaves. But it grew louder, more distinct, wet and ragged, as if someone were struggling to pull air into ruined lungs. Anna froze, her hands gripping the flashlight. She scanned the darkness outside the tent, the beam of light bouncing off the trees. Nothing. Hello, she called, her voice shaking. Is someone there? No reply. Just the breathing, now impossibly close. Her heart thundered as she zipped up the tent door and curled into herself, clutching the flashlight like a talisman. Hours seemed to pass, the sound circling her camp, stopping, then starting again. Finally, exhaustion overtook her, and she slipped into a restless sleep. When Anna woke, it was still dark. The first thing she noticed was the smell, coppery and pungent, like rusted metal left in the rain. Then she saw it. The backpack was inside her tent. It sat upright, as though placed there deliberately. The dark stain on its side was now glistening, fresh blood pooling beneath it and soaking into the fabric of her sleeping bag. Anna scrambled backward, her breath coming in short gasps. The zipper to the tent was still closed, but the bag hadn't been there when she fell asleep. Her trembling hands reached for the journal, desperate for answers. Flipping to the smeared page, she reread the last line. It always comes back. The breathing returned, louder this time, resonating inside the tent. She whipped around, shining the flashlight toward the source, but the beam faltered, flickering like a dying star. Something shifted in the corner. A figure emerged, hunched and unnatural, its limbs too long and its skin pale and slick, like it had just crawled out of the swamp. Its face was obscured by shadow, but Anna could feel its eyes on her, hungry, piercing. She screamed, scrambling to unzip the tent. The creature moved with her, a low growl rumbling from its chest. The air inside the tent grew heavy, thick with the stench of decay. When she finally burst free, the forest was alive with sound, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and that relentless, guttural breathing. Anna ran, leaving the tent and the cursed backpack behind. Days later, a search party found her wandering the edge of the forest, incoherent and trembling. She clutched a blood-stained journal, repeating the same words over and over. It always comes back. It always comes back. When the search team returned to retrieve her belongings, they found the campsite. The tent was shredded, the ground stained red, and the backpack was gone. Story 4. The four of them, Ben, Lily, Marcus, and Katie, had picked the lakeside campsite for its isolation. They wanted to get away from the noise of the world, from endless notifications and responsibilities. But the lake, it wasn't like the pictures. The water was too dark, too still, and the air around it carried a damp chill that clung to their skin, even during the day. It's perfect, Marcus had joked, dumping his backpack near the fire pit. A little spooky, but perfect. By the time the fire crackled to life that evening, the forest around them was silent except for the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. They roasted marshmallows, swapping jokes and ghost stories. Marcus, the self-appointed comedian of the group, kept making eerie noises to freak out Katie, who hated the dark. But then, from across the lake, came a sound that froze them all. It was faint at first, a high-pitched wail that rose and fell, like someone crying. "Is that an animal?" Katie asked, her voice trembling. Ben shook his head. "Doesn't sound like it. It's two." He trailed off, unable to find a word. "Human," Lily whispered. The crying grew louder, more distinct, echoing across the still water. It wasn't just sobbing, it was pleading. "Help me." The four of them exchanged uneasy glances. "Could be someone in trouble," Marcus said, already standing up. He grabbed his flashlight. "We should check it out. Are you insane?" Katie snapped. "What if it's some lunatic trying to lure us out there? Or someone drowning?" Marcus shot back. Lily hesitated. "Let's at least see if we can spot anything from the shore." They moved together, flashlights slicing through the inky darkness. The crying continued, growing louder as they approached the edge of the lake. The water was so still it looked like black glass, reflecting the sliver of the moon above. "Hello," Marcus called, his voice echoing. "Is someone out there?" The crying stopped. Silence pressed in around them. "I don't like this," Katie whispered, clutching Ben's arm. And then the sound came again, this time closer. It wasn't from across the lake anymore. It was right at the water's edge. "Help me." Marcus stepped closer, shining his flashlight over the surface. "I think I see something. Over there." He pointed to a dark shape floating near the middle of the lake. "It could be a person." "Don't," Lily began, but Marcus was already wading into the water. The moment his feet touched the surface, the crying stopped again. "Marcus, get back here," Katie hissed, but he didn't listen. He moved deeper, the water rising to his knees, his waist. "Marcus, stop," Ben shouted. Marcus paused, turning back to look at them. His face was pale, his eyes wide. I see." Something yanked him under. A single, sharp splash, and he was gone. They screamed his name, rushing to the shore, but the water was still again, rippling only where he'd vanished. "Marcus!" Lily shouted, her voice cracking. No answer. They searched for hours, their flashlights sweeping the lake and the surrounding woods, but there was no sign of him. Finally, exhausted and terrified, they huddled by the fire, too afraid to sleep. When the first light of dawn broke, Ben noticed something strange. "Guys," he said, his voice shaking, "look." Leading from the water's edge to their campsite were wet footprints. Bare footprints, too large to be Marcus's. They stopped just a few feet away from their tents. "Do you think?" Katie whispered, but she couldn't finish the sentence. "Marcus," Lily called out weakly. There was no reply, only the faint sound of ripples lapping against the shore. They packed up and left in a rush, abandoning most of their gear. Marcus was never found. Weeks later, another group of campers reported hearing cries by the lake, but when they went to investigate, they found nothing but wet footprints trailing into the woods. The lake still cries at night, they say, and every time someone answers, it takes another. Story 5. Tom was a man who thrived on solitude. Hiking alone through dense, remote trails gave him the kind of peace the noisy city never could. This time, he'd ventured farther than ever before, into a stretch of forest few dared to explore. By late afternoon, the sun hung low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. That's when Tom saw it, a weathered, torn tent, sagging under its own weight, tucked between the trees about 30 yards off the trail. Something about it was wrong. The canvas was faded to a sickly green, streaked with brown stains. The poles leaned as if they'd been forced into the ground by unsteady hands. It looked abandoned, maybe forgotten. Tom considered walking past it, but curiosity gnawed at him. Who had left it here, and why? He stepped closer and called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" Silence. Cautiously, he approached the tent and crouched down. The flaps hung open, revealing nothing but an empty interior. Still, there was an uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach, like someone was watching him from just beyond the trees. The sun was setting, and Tom decided to make camp a few hundred feet away, near a clearing. He told himself it was better to be nearby, just in case someone returned for their tent. That night, Tom built a fire and settled in. The chirping of crickets filled the air, and the scent of pine mingled with the smoke from his campfire. But as the night deepened, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. No wind, no animals, just the crackling of flames. And then, at the edge of his hearing, there came a sound, a faint rustling. Tom froze, straining to listen. It was coming from where the abandoned tent had been. Slowly, he grabbed his flashlight and shone it in that direction. The tent was gone. He blinked, stepping closer to the spot. The ground where the tent had been was bare, but a dark trail of something wet, led away into the trees. Blood. His throat tightened. It had to be a prank, maybe some teenagers messing around. Tom backed away, heart pounding, and spent the rest of the night gripping his knife under his sleeping bag. The next day, he packed up early and moved deeper into the forest, putting miles between himself and the eerie campsite. By evening, he found a new spot near a brook. The bubbling water calmed him, and the day's hike had drained his nerves. But as dusk fell, a creeping sense of unease returned. It was too quiet again, the air thick with something unseen. When Tom looked up, His breath caught in his throat. There it was, the same tent. It was only 20 feet away this time, its tattered flaps swaying slightly, though there was no breeze. He couldn't look away. He swore the stains on the canvas had grown darker, redder. Fear clawed at his chest, but he forced himself to approach. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice trembling. The tent didn't answer. He crept closer, one hesitant step at a time, his flashlight trained on the dark opening. The beam caught something inside, a shape, slumped and unmoving. "Hey," he called louder now. No response. Heart hammering, Tom reached out and yanked the flap open. There was nothing. The tent was empty. But when he turned to leave, he saw footprints, bare, human footprints, leading out of the tent and toward his campsite. Tom didn't sleep that night. He stayed by the fire, clutching his knife and flashlight, every muscle tensed. The hours dragged, but nothing happened. When dawn broke, he packed up and left, vowing to head straight back to civilization. But the forest had other plans. By late afternoon, Tom realized he was lost. The trail markers were gone, replaced by endless trees that seemed to shift and close in on him. He trudged forward, desperate, until he stumbled into a small clearing. And there it was again, the tent. Only this time, it wasn't tattered. It stood tall and clean, its canvas pristine, almost inviting. A cold dread washed over Tom as he realized there were no stains, no rips. Just a single word painted in bold red letters across the front. "Welcome." The flap opened on its own, and Tom swore he heard faint laughter echoing from within. The forest seemed to tighten around him, leaving him no choice but to step closer. As he did, the last rays of sunlight disappeared, and the tent swallowed him whole. Weeks later, a group of hikers stumbled upon a tattered tent deep in the woods. Inside, they found a knife, a flashlight, and a journal. The final entry read, "It's watching me. I can't escape. If you find this, don't go near the tent." Story 6. The Jenkins family wasn't much for camping, but this trip was different. Rachel, the mother, had insisted on unplugging for a weekend. "It'll be good for us," she had said, and her husband, Tom, reluctantly agreed. Their teenage daughter, Lila, and 8-year-old son, Ben, were less enthusiastic, but they packed their gear and headed for the secluded Pine Hollow campgrounds. By the time they reached their site, dusk was settling in. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of pine needles and earth. Tom busied himself setting up the fire while the others unpacked. The flames sputtered to life, sending sparks dancing into the growing darkness. "Finally," Tom muttered, brushing his hands off on his jeans. Rachel spread out a blanket and passed around marshmallows. The fire crackled warmly, and soon the family was laughing and telling stories. Then it happened. The flames twisted, flaring suddenly high and bright. Ben gasped, dropping his marshmallow stick. "Mom, Dad, look." The fire danced in unnatural patterns, forming jagged shapes. Tom squinted and frowned. For a moment, he thought he saw a face, a cruel, grinning face, its mouth wide and leering. "It's just the wind," Tom said, forcing a laugh. He poked at the logs with a stick. but the fire hissed angrily, sending out another flurry of sparks. "No, Dad," Lila said, her voice trembling. "It looks like it's moving on its own." Rachel leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "Tom, it's not just the wind." The fire crackled again, louder this time, almost like a growl. Then came the voice. "Leave this place." It wasn't a human voice. It was low, guttural, and seemed to come from the flames themselves. The family froze, staring at the fire in stunned silence. What was that?" Rachel whispered, pulling Ben closer. Tom shook his head, his face pale. "Probably just leave now." The voice boomed louder, and the fire flared violently, throwing shadows across the trees. Faces danced in the flames again, grotesque and angry, their mouths moving silently. Ben screamed and pointed toward the woods. "Eyes! I see eyes!" The family turned as one. Beyond the flickering light of the fire, the darkness seemed to ripple and shift. Then they saw them red, glowing eyes. At first, just one pair, then two, then dozens. They were scattered throughout the trees, blinking slowly, unblinking and fixed on the family. "What the hell?" Tom breathed, backing toward the fire. Rachel grabbed Ben and Lila, pulling them close. "Tom, we have to go." Tom nodded, his bravado gone. He grabbed a flashlight, but when he shone it into the woods, the beam seemed to die in the dense blackness. The eyes didn't waver. "Back to the car," Tom whispered, his voice shaking. "Now." They moved as a group, Rachel clutching Ben and Lila's hands while Tom kept the flashlight pointed at the woods. The fire behind them hissed and popped, but the warning was clear. They weren't welcome here. As they reached the edge of the campsite, the eyes seemed to grow closer. Low growls echoed through the trees, followed by snapping branches. "Run!" Tom shouted, and they sprinted toward the car. Rachel fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling, before unlocking the doors. They piled in, and Tom turned the ignition. The headlights pierced the darkness, and for a moment, the family caught a glimpse of what had been watching them. Tall, gaunt figures stood at the tree line, their faces pale and hollow. Their red eyes burned like coals, and their mouths twisted into unnatural grins. The car roared to life, and Tom floored it. Gravel sprayed as they sped down the dirt road, leaving the campsite and whatever had been there behind. No one spoke on the drive home. The fire's warning echoed in their minds. When they finally reached their house, Rachel locked the doors and drew the curtains. Tom stayed up all night, staring out the window. They never spoke of the camping trip again, and the Pine Hollow campgrounds remained off limits. But sometimes, late at night, Tom swore he could still hear the fire's voice, warning him. They're still watching. Story 7. The forest loomed thick and dark as the setting sun cast long, jagged shadows across the ground. It was the kind of forest that didn't feel welcoming, no matter how much sunlight spilled through the canopy during the day. By dusk, it was a different world entirely, silent, cold, and alive with something you couldn't quite name. Ethan, Mia, Sam, and Lily, for teenagers with too much time and not enough fear, ventured into these woods on a dare. They had spent the last hour following a barely visible trail that snaked deeper into the wilderness, each step accompanied by a mixture of excitement and unease. "Do you guys feel that?" Mia whispered, clutching the strap of her backpack. "What? Regret?" Ethan smirked, kicking a rock off the path. "No," she said, glancing around. "It's colder all of a sudden. Way colder." Sam shivered, though he would never admit it. "That's just your imagination. We're in a forest. It gets chilly at night." "Big deal." Lily stopped abruptly, pointing ahead. "What's that?" The group followed her gaze and saw it. A perfect circle of stones, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The stones were jagged, each about waist high, and they seemed deliberately placed. The circle was unnervingly precise, as though someone or something had measured it with care. "Looks like someone built a fire pit," Ethan said, though he didn't sound convinced. "No way," Lily whispered. "It's too perfect." The group approached cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth. As they drew closer, the air grew colder, the silence heavier. "Okay," Ethan said, trying to mask his nervousness with bravado. "Who's brave enough to step inside?" Mia shook her head. "We shouldn't. This feels wrong." "Come on," Ethan said, rolling his eyes. "It's just rocks. What's the worst that could happen?" Sam hesitated, then stepped forward. "Fine, I'll do it. If I don't, Ethan's never going to shut up about it." He stepped into the circle. The change was immediate. The air inside the stones was frigid, biting at his skin like icy needles. His breath came out in visible puffs, even though it wasn't winter. And then he heard it, a faint, distant screaming, like someone shouting from deep underground. "What the hell?" Sam muttered, spinning around. The others stared at him, their faces pale. "What's wrong?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "You don't hear that?" Sam asked, his voice rising. "The screaming?" Ethan laughed nervously. "Cut it out, man. You're freaking us out." But then Ethan stepped inside, too, and his smirk disappeared. "Oh, God. Oh, God. I hear it." "What do you hear?" Lily asked, panic creeping into her voice. It's like someone's trapped, yelling for help." Ethan stammered, his eyes wide. Lily and Mia exchanged a look, then, as if pulled by some invisible force, stepped inside together. The world shifted. The cold was unbearable, seeping into their bones. The screaming wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a wailing that came from everywhere and nowhere. The trees outside the circle seemed impossibly far away, their shapes distorted and wrong. Then everything went black. When they woke, it was morning. They were lying on the ground outside the stone circle, dew clinging to their clothes. The stones stood silently in the clearing, their jagged edges catching the first rays of sunlight. Ethan sat up first, rubbing his head. What happened?" "I don't remember," Sam muttered, his voice hollow. Mia looked down at her hands and gasped. "Why are my nails so dirty?" They all looked at their hands. Dirt caked beneath their nails, and their fingertips were scratched and raw, as if they'd been digging with their bare hands. "Did we do something in the circle?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No one answered, but when they turned to leave, they noticed something chilling. A new stone had appeared in the circle, smaller than the others but jagged and out of place, as though it had been recently added. Carved into its surface were 4 sets of initials. From that day on, the teenagers never spoke of the stone circle, but every now and then, in the dead of night, each of them dreamed of digging in the cold, damp earth while the screaming echoed around them. And in those dreams, they weren't alone. Story 8. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a break from the noise, the rush, the endless to-do lists of their daily lives. A group of friends, tired of city lights and technology, decided to spend a few days in the mountains. They picked a campsite near a remote lake, far from the distractions of the modern world. Just the crackling of the campfire, the chirping of crickets, and the wind rustling through the trees. But they'd soon learn the forest held far more than that. The first day went without incident. They set up their tents, collected firewood, and spent hours hiking through the dense woods, laughing and snapping photos. The air was crisp, the trees towering, their branches swaying like ancient sentinels. Everything felt normal, but then, as the sun began to dip behind the trees, they came across something that would change everything. It was a small clearing just a few hundred yards from the lake. At first, it looked like just another abandoned campsite. A fire pit, now cold and covered in ash. A few ragged sleeping bags. But as they approached, something caught their eye. A weathered leather journal, lying open on a pile of dry leaves, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. "Hey, check this out," Mark said, crouching beside the journal. He flipped the cover, revealing an old, scribbled handwriting. The others gathered around him. "Who leaves something like this behind?" Emily muttered, but none of them could pull away from the words on the pages. The journal, they discovered, belonged to a camper named Daniel Harding. The entries were dated several years ago, long enough that the pages had become fragile, the ink smudged in places. As Mark read aloud, the first few entries sounded like the usual ramblings of someone enjoying a solo camping trip. Daniel had been on his own, setting up camp by the lake, talking about the peace and quiet of the woods, the beauty of the landscape. But as the days went by, the tone of the journal began to change. Day 4, it's getting harder to sleep. I swear I hear something calling my name. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it's too clear. A voice soft, almost like a whisper. When I wake up, I hear it again. Daniel, Daniel. Day 5, the voice won't stop. It's always there, just beyond the reach of my campfire, just outside the edge of the shadows. Sometimes it sounds like someone's standing right behind me. I turn around, but nothing's there. My skin crawls, and I can't seem to shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Emily's voice faltered as she read aloud. This guy sounded like he was losing it. "Just wait," Mark said, his eyes wide. "It gets worse." Day 7. I'm losing track of time. It's getting hard to focus. Every night, the voice gets louder, and it's not just calling my name anymore. It says things I don't understand. I don't know if it's the woods or if I've gone mad, but something is out there. Something that wants me. Day 8. The trees are closing in. I swear I can feel something breathing behind me when I walk through the woods. It smells like earth, like decay. I don't know how long I've been here, but I can't leave. Every time I try, the voice drags me back. Daniel, Daniel, Jesus, Emily whispered. This guy went off the deep end. The group stood in stunned silence, the words hanging heavily in the air. None of them had ever read anything so unsettling. Mark flipped the page, his finger trembling slightly as he traced the next entry. Day 9. It's here. I can hear it now, right behind me. It speaks in my ear, just before I fall asleep. The voice is getting stronger, like it's becoming part of me. Daniel, Daniel, you have to listen. You have to find it. The thing that's calling you. That was the last entry. The pages after that were empty, save for a few smudges and scratches, as though Daniel had been desperately writing something, only to be interrupted. Did he die out here? Emily's voice was barely audible, her eyes wide with fear. I don't know, Mark said, his voice tight, but there's no record of him ever being found. They stood there in the silence of the forest, the eerie, quiet pressing in on them like the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes. The wind had died down, and the trees seemed unnervingly still. Then, just as they were about to turn away, they heard it, a soft whisper. Daniel. It wasn't loud, not at first, just a faint murmur, as though the wind had caught something. But then the voice spoke again, clearer this time. Daniel, Daniel. They froze, their hearts hammering in their chests. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't any animal or distant noise. It was the same voice from the journal, the same voice that had driven Daniel mad. Do you hear that? Mark whispered, his eyes darting around the clearing. The others nodded, frozen with fear. Then the whisper came again, but this time it was louder. Daniel. The air grew cold. A strange pressure, like the presence of something unseen, filled the space around them. The voice was calling to them, just as it had called to Daniel, urging them to listen, to come closer. And for a moment, they almost did. Then, without warning, they all bolted, scrambling back toward their tents. The voice followed them, always just a whisper away, haunting them, calling them by name. That night, none of them slept. They lay wide-eyed in their tents, listening as the voice faded into the distance, but never completely went away. When they woke the next morning, the campsite was empty. The journal was gone, and the forest was silent. They never spoke of it again. Years later, they still wonder if Daniel Harding had ever really been out there, or if he was just another part of the forest's dark, twisted history. Some things are better left unknown. But one thing was certain. The voice had called to them, just as it had called to him, and no one who hears it is ever quite the same again. Story 9. It was supposed to be a simple hike, just a few friends, a clear morning, and the promise of adventure in the wild. The kind of trip where you leave the noise of the city behind and lose yourself in the vast, untouched forests. The kind of trip that makes you feel alive. At least that's what they thought. Kyle, Sarah, James, and Emily had been walking for hours, following a winding trail that carved through dense trees and over rushing streams. Their feet were tired, but their spirits were high. They joked and laughed, sharing stories of high school and childhood memories, forgetting the weight of the world for just a little while. The woods had a way of making everything feel distant, peaceful, and safe. But that feeling would soon slip away. The sun had begun to dip behind the treetops when they stumbled across the cabin. It wasn't marked on any map. The woods around it were thick with underbrush, and the building seemed almost swallowed by the forest itself. From a distance, it looked abandoned, its weathered wood darkened by years of rain and neglect. The windows were boarded up, and a thin layer of moss clung to the roof like a ghostly blanket. "That's weird," Emily said, stopping in her tracks. "I don't remember any cabins around here." Sarah squinted toward the cabin. "Maybe it's old, abandoned. No one's been up here in years, I bet." Kyle grinned. "Let's check it out. We've come this far. What's a creepy old cabin between friends?" James, the most cautious of the group, hesitated. "I don't know, guys. It feels wrong, like it's not supposed to be here." But the others were already walking toward it, and James didn't want to seem like a coward, so he followed reluctantly. As they approached, a strange noise sliced through the air, low, guttural, and unmistakable. A howl. But it wasn't the howl of any wolf or wild animal they'd ever heard. This was deeper, more intense, a sound that seemed to rattle the very air around them. It echoed from inside the cabin, sending a chill down their spines. The group stopped, exchanging uneasy glances. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. Kyle nodded slowly, his confidence wavering. "Yeah, that wasn't normal. Probably just some coyotes or a stray dog, right?" James's voice trembled. "I don't think it was an animal. It sounded too human." But before anyone could respond, another howl ripped through the air, louder this time and closer. It made their blood run cold. The sound echoed in their bones, making them feel like they were being pulled into something dark and hungry. "Okay, that's enough," Emily said, her voice sharp now. "Let's just go. This place is messed up." But Kyle, ever the adventurer, pushed forward. "Come on, guys. It's just a howl. Let's see what's inside." The door creaked loudly as they pushed it open. The smell inside was stale, like years of dust and decay. The walls were lined with shadows, the faint light from the setting sun barely making it through the cracks. The air felt thick, heavy with a sense of something ancient, something watching. They fanned out, searching the cabin. There was nothing of interest, no furniture, no belongings. Just old, cracked floorboards and shattered windows. "See? Nothing," Kyle said, brushing his hands on his pants. "Let's head back to camp." But then, as they turned to leave, something caught James's eye. He gasped, stumbling back. His arms, his bare arms, were covered in deep, jagged scratches. "What the hell?" he whispered, looking at the red streaks of blood across his skin. He hadn't felt a thing. "James, what happened?" Sarah asked, rushing toward him. "I don't know," he said, panic rising in his voice. "I swear I didn't even feel anything. These weren't here before." The group gathered around him, each of them staring in horror at the scratches. They were deep, too deep for just a brush with a tree. They were fresh, raw, and they looked like claws had raked across his arms. "Maybe you scratched yourself on the door," Emily suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. But James shook his head. "No, I didn't. I swear I didn't feel anything." That's when the howling started again. This time, it wasn't distant. It was right outside the cabin, close enough to feel the wind it carried. The howl was followed by a heavy thud, then another and another. Something was moving out there, something with weight, something that didn't belong. They rushed to the windows, peering out into the darkening forest. Nothing was visible, but the sound was unmistakable. A presence, something enormous, was circling the cabin. "I think we need to leave," Kyle said, his voice cracking. The bravado he once had was gone, replaced by a rising fear. But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them with a force that nearly shook the cabin off its foundation. They tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The howls grew louder, closer, and the scratching began, as if something was trying to claw its way inside. James looked at the others, panic in his eyes. "It's not just the cabin," he said, his voice trembling. "Something is in the woods with us, and it knows we're here." The howls turned into screams, human-like screams that twisted with pain and hunger. The air was thick with an almost tangible sense of dread. Something was alive in the dark, watching, waiting, and it was hungry. In the distance, a shadow moved, too large to be anything human. Something with glowing eyes that reflected the last light of day. The group turned away from the door, their hearts pounding. They had to get out, but the scratching on the door wasn't the only thing they heard. The sound of claws dragging across the floor behind them made their blood freeze in their veins. The thing was in the cabin with them, and it was closer than they'd ever imagined. Story 10. It was the kind of night that made the woods feel alive. The sky, full of stars, was the only thing that didn't seem to be shifting or whispering. The trees stood in stillness, their branches trembling lightly as if they had a secret to share, but they wouldn't tell. For friends, Michael, Sarah, Jake, and Emma had set up camp at the edge of Black Ridge, a place known to few and feared by most. Legends of disappearances, strange lights, and mysterious figures had long haunted the area, but that didn't bother them. They were seasoned campers. The thrill of the unknown was something they lived for. They'd spent the day hiking the rugged terrain, trekking miles across thick forests, and now, as the evening chill set in, they sat around a fire, laughing and sharing stories. It was Sarah's idea to head to the cliff's edge before calling it a night. She had heard stories of a lantern that swung out over the cliffs at night, held by no one but seen by all. The others were skeptical, but curiosity got the better of them. "Let's just take a quick look," Jake said, standing up and dusting the dirt from his pants. They grabbed their flashlights and left the warmth of their campfire behind, stepping into the darkness of the forest. The path to the cliff was narrow, winding around trees and jagged rocks, but they didn't mind. They were used to the trails, even those that led to places whispered about in town as being cursed. When they finally arrived, they saw it. A single lantern hung from an old, crooked tree right at the edge of the cliff. It swayed in the breeze, its flame flickering, casting a soft, golden glow across the steep drop. But no one was near it. The light danced alone in the vast emptiness of the night, casting eerie shadows along the ridge. It's just a lantern," Michael said, his voice uncertain. "Someone must have left it here." "But it's not lit by the wind," Emma said quietly, stepping closer. "It's alive somehow. Sarah, Always the brave one moved forward. Let's take a closer look. They approached the lantern cautiously. It was old, its brass casing tarnished with age. The glass was cracked, but the flame inside burned steadily, as if it had been there for hours, days, even longer. No smoke, no flicker of movement in the air, just a glow. Michael reached out a hand toward it, but before he could touch the lantern, Jake grabbed his arm. "Wait," he whispered, his voice tight. "I don't like this." But Sarah was already crouching beside the lantern, studying it closely. "It's just strange, that's all. Maybe it's some kind of marker. A warning." As she said the word warning, the ground beneath them seemed to shift. The wind stopped. The trees, which had been creaking softly, fell silent. Then, in the stillness, a sound, a soft whisper, came from behind them. It was faint, like the rustle of leaves, but it was unmistakable. A voice. "Help me." The four friends turned, their flashlights darting through the darkness. But there was nothing, no one, just the forest closing in on them. Sarah stood up, brushing dirt from her knees, her voice trembling. "We should go." The others didn't need to be told twice. They began to retreat, but the ground seemed to shift beneath them. And that's when it happened. As Michael turned to head back toward the trail, he felt it, a sharp shove in his back, a force so sudden and strong it almost knocked him off his feet. He stumbled, his arms flailing for balance, and before he could catch himself, he felt something, someone push harder. "No," he cried out, spinning around to see nothing but darkness behind him. But there was no time to react. He felt the edge of the cliff under his boot, too close. He tried to step back, but the force was too strong. Another push. "Michael!" Sarah screamed. She reached for him, but it was too late. He was already falling. In that split second, as his body hurtled toward the bottom of the cliff, the lantern's glow illuminated his face for one final, fleeting moment. And in that light, Michael saw them. Figures, shadowy, indistinct forms standing at the base of the cliff, watching him fall. Their eyes glowed faintly, burning red in the dim light. And though he couldn't make out their faces, he could feel their hunger. They were waiting for him. Then the world went black. The others stood frozen, the wind howling around them. Sarah, Jake, and Emma ran to the edge, their hearts pounding, but it was too late. Michael was gone. The lantern still burned, its light flickering softly, as though nothing had changed. But something had changed. They could feel it in their bones. Sarah turned to Jake and Emma, her face pale. "We have to leave, now." They ran back to camp, not looking back, not daring to even glance at the cliff. When they made it to their tents, breathless and terrified, they found Michael's backpack lying on the ground near the campfire. His flashlight was beside it, still glowing faintly, but there was no sign of him. The lantern, however, was still burning at the edge of the cliff, and the whispers, soft and insistent, began again. "Help me." They never spoke of that night again. Some things are better left forgotten, but every now and then, when the wind is still and the lanterns burn too bright, they hear the whispers calling them back to the edge, and they wonder if it's just the wind or something far worse.